They fell in love in school, and in a quiet moment, one thing led to another, a one-night stand. A few days later, she found out she was pregnant, but her parents said no to him just because he's a Christian. Now, the court will decide their fate. What will happen next? Don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button for more juicy stories. It was a bright, sunny day at the NYSC orientation camp in Kaduna. The new corps members, all dressed in their white t-shirts and shorts, looked like a massive group of people in matching outfits. This was why their camp commander jokingly called them white fowls. The large field where they exercised buzzed with laughter, drilling commands and animated conversations. Tunde stood in formation, sweat trickling down his back as the camp commandant barked orders. He wasn't particularly excited about the 3-week camp experience, but he had to admit there was something thrilling about it. The sense of new beginnings, new people, and the unknown adventures that awaited. And then he saw her. Aisha stood a few rows ahead, effortlessly graceful as she adjusted her NYSC cap under the scorching sun. Her deep brown skin glowed in the heat, and when she smiled at something her friend said, Tunde felt his breath hitch. She was beautiful, but it wasn't just that. There was something about the way she carried herself, poised, confident, and completely unaware of how she had just turned his world upside down. It wasn't until later that day, during platoon drills, that fate finally gave them a reason to speak. The instructor paired them up for a team-building exercise, and as luck would have it, Tunde found himself standing beside Aisha. "You're sweating already?" she teased, tilting her head as she looked at him. Tunde chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "What can I say? The Kaduna sun is different from the Lagos sun." Aisha laughed, a light musical sound that sent warmth spreading through Tunde's chest. "I take it you're a Lagos boy? Born and raised?" He smiled. "And you?" "Kano," she replied, tucking a stray strand of hair under her hijab. "But I schooled in Abuja." As the days passed, their conversations grew longer. They met during morning drills, chatted during community development service sessions, and stole moments together under the trees near the Mami market, where corps members gathered to eat and unwind. Aisha fascinated Tunde in ways he couldn't quite explain. She was intelligent, witty, and fiercely independent. She spoke about journalism with a passion that only made him admire her more. "You ever think about what comes after camp?" he asked one evening as they sat on a bench, watching the sun dip behind the hills. Aisha smiled. "Sometimes. I want to write stories that matter, stories that change things." Tunde studied her, feeling an unfamiliar but undeniable sense of awe. "You're amazing, you know that?" Aisha rolled her eyes, laughing. "Says the guy who wants to build the next tallest skyscraper in Nigeria." He grinned. "You remember that?" "Of course." She nudged his arm playfully. "You talk about architecture like it's your first love." Tunde turned to her then, his eyes searching hers. "Maybe my first love has changed." Aisha's breath caught, her heart pounding as Tunde's gaze lingered on her. And just like that, under the setting sun of NYSC camp, something unspoken passed between them. A connection too strong to ignore. After camp ended, their relationship only grew stronger. They were posted to different parts of Kaduna for their primary assignments, but that didn't stop them. They spent weekends exploring the city, holding hands as they wandered through markets, laughing over suya and cold drinks in tucked-away restaurants. Tunde was everything Aisha never expected. Kind, thoughtful, and endlessly patient. He made her feel seen, understood, and cherished. She, in turn, brought a new kind of joy into his life, one filled with deep conversations and a love that felt like it could withstand anything. But love, as they would soon learn, was never just about two people. The first time Aisha mentioned Tunde to her family, the warmth in her father's eyes disappeared. "Aisha, you cannot be serious," Al-Haji Ibrahim said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "A Muslim woman cannot marry a Christian. It is against our faith." Aisha's mother sighed, shaking her head. "You will bring shame upon this family." "But Tunde respects my faith," Aisha argued. "He has never asked me to change." Her father's expression hardened. "That is not the point." Meanwhile, Tunde faced his own share of resistance. One evening, his mother, a devout Christian, sat him down, concern etched on her face. "Tunde, love is important, but so is faith. How will you raise your children? What if her family never accepts you?" Tunde ran a hand through his hair. "Mummy, I love her. Isn't that enough?" But for their families, love wasn't enough. Aisha's father introduced her to suitable Muslim suitors, hoping to change her mind. Her movements were restricted, her phone monitored, her freedom stripped away. Still, she and Tunde found ways to be together. Secret meetings in cafes, late-night phone calls, whispered "I love yous" that carried the weight of every obstacle in their path. One night, after yet another explosive fight with her father, Aisha ran to Tunde's apartment, tears streaming down her face. Without a word, she collapsed into his arms, clinging to him as if he were the only thing keeping her from breaking. "I don't know what to do anymore," she whispered against his chest. "I love you, but I don't want to lose my family." Tunde held her tightly. "Then let's run away. Let's start fresh somewhere." Aisha pulled back, searching his face. "Tunde, we can't." His thumb brushed away her tears. "Then we'll fight together." That night, lost in the intensity of their emotions, they crossed a line they never intended to. What started as comfort turned into passion, a love that consumed them whole. In that moment, they belonged entirely to each other. A few weeks passed, and Aisha fell ill. She tried every medication she knew, but nothing worked. A friend suggested she take a pregnancy test, just to be sure. And there she was, sitting at the edge of her bed, gripping the pregnancy test with trembling hands. Two bold lines stared back at her, confirming what she had feared. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. She had imagined this moment countless times, but never like this. Never with dread curling in her stomach, never with the weight of her father's judgment looming over her. Just then, her mother, Hajia Mariam, entered the room, her sharp eyes immediately narrowing at the sight of Aisha's pale face. "What is it?" she asked, setting down the tray of food she had brought in. Aisha opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she held up the test. For a moment there was silence. Then her mother's breath hitched. "Ya Allah," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hands. Tears welled up in Aisha's eyes. "Mama, I'm pregnant." Hajia Mariam sank onto the bed beside her, shaking her head in disbelief. "Aisha, how could you?" "I didn't plan for this to happen," Aisha said, her voice cracking. "I love him, Mama. I love Tunde." Her mother's face hardened. "Love?" she repeated, her voice laced with disappointment. "Do you have any idea what this means? What your father will do?" Aisha wiped her tears. "I have to tell him. He deserves to know." Her mother exhaled heavily, rubbing her temples. "Your father, he won't accept this. He won't accept him." That night, Hajia Mariam waited until her husband Al-Haji Ibrahim had finished his evening prayers before she approached him. She chose her words carefully, but no amount of caution could soften the storm that followed. "What did you just say?" Al-Haji Ibrahim's voice boomed through the house. His face, usually composed, was twisted with rage. "She is pregnant," Hajia Mariam repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, "with Tunde's child." Al-Haji Ibrahim shot to his feet, knocking over the teacup on the table, his hands clenched into fists. "That boy? That Christian boy? Aisha has disgraced this family. She says she loves him," Hajia Mariam dared to add. "Love?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Love does not exist between a Muslim girl and a Christian boy. She will not see him again. I will not let my daughter ruin her future with this mistake." From the hallway, Aisha, who had been listening in silence, stepped forward, her body trembling. "Baba, please," she pleaded. "Tunde wants to take responsibility. He loves me, and he will take care of us." Her father's eyes burned with fury as he turned to her. "You are no longer the daughter I raised. You have brought shame to my name." Tears streamed down Aisha's face. "Baba, please." "Enough," he bellowed. "From this moment on, you will have nothing to do with that boy. You are leaving this house tomorrow. You will stay with your aunt in Kaduna until this disgrace is behind us." Aisha's heart shattered. "No, Baba, please don't take me away from him." But her father's decision was final. That night, as Aisha lay in bed, clutching her stomach, she knew one thing for certain. Her life would never be the same again. She had to tell Tunde everything so they could figure out their next move. Tunde sat on a wooden bench outside his one-room apartment, scrolling through his phone absent-mindedly. The evening breeze carried the distant sounds of car horns and street vendors calling out their wares. His mind, however, was elsewhere, on Aisha, on the way her laughter lingered in his thoughts, on the way she made him feel like the luckiest man in the world. His phone buzzed. Can we talk? It's important." A strange feeling stirred in his chest. Without hesitation, he dialed her number. She picked up on the first ring. "Tunde," she breathed. Her voice was shaky, hesitant. "What's wrong?" he asked, already feeling a knot form in his stomach. A long pause. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a moving truck. His mind went blank. The world around him blurred, and for the first time in his life, he felt completely unprepared for what was coming next. "Pregnant?" he echoed, as if saying it aloud would make it less real. "Yes." His heart pounded. He had just finished NYSC. He had no stable job, no real plan for his future yet. How was he supposed to take care of a child? "Aisha, are you sure?" His voice was unsteady. "I took the test twice," she said, vulnerability lacing her voice. "I'm sure, Tunde." He rubbed a hand over his face. I don't know what to say." "Tunde, please talk to me," she pleaded. "I need to know we're in this together." But he couldn't speak. His thoughts were a chaotic mess. Fear clawed at his chest. Doubt whispered in his ear. "What are we going to do?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Aisha swallowed hard. "I was hoping we'd figure it out together." But Tunde couldn't think straight. He wasn't ready for this. He loved Aisha, but a baby right now? I need time to think," he said finally. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When Aisha spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I don't have time, Tunde. My father is already suspicious. If I tell him, he won't let me see you again." Tunde felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of the situation. He exhaled shakily. "I don't know, Aisha." That was all she needed to hear. Her heart shattered. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I understand," she said, her voice hollow. "Goodbye, Tunde." Before he could stop her, the line went dead. Days passed and Tunde's mind was in turmoil. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. The fear had been real, but so was his love for Aisha. Running from this wouldn't solve anything. He needed to man up. He picked up his phone and dialed Aisha's number. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Panic set in. He rushed to her house, only to find the gates locked. He knocked desperately, but the security guard barely spared him a glance. "They're gone," the man said gruffly. Tunde's heart dropped. "Gone? Gone where?" "I don't know, but they left this morning." Her father looked angry. A chill ran through Tunde's veins. He had waited too long. Frantic, he called Lanre. "Bro, I messed up. Aisha's gone. I need to find her." Lanre sighed heavily. "I heard her dad sent her to her aunt's place in Kaduna." Kaduna. The word felt like a punch to the gut. He had been too afraid, too hesitant, and now the love of his life, the mother of his child, had been taken away, and he had no idea if he would ever see her again. 5 years had passed since Tunde last saw Aisha. 5 years of pain, regret, and longing for the family that never was. But now, news had reached him. Aisha was back. She had returned to the city. With their son, Khalid. A tidal wave of emotions crashed over him. His heart pounded with hope and fear all at once. He couldn't waste another second. He needed to see them. He needed to see his son. He grabbed his phone and dialed Aisha's number. The call rang and rang, but no answer. His chest tightened. He tried again. This time, the call was declined. His stomach twisted with frustration. What had happened to the Aisha he once knew? Why was she shutting him out? He had spent years regretting not being there for Khalid, and now, when he was finally ready to step up, she was keeping him at arm's length. Tunde wasn't one to give up easily. He couldn't just sit back and wait for Aisha to come to him. He had to prove himself, to her and to Khalid. He knew the risks, but he couldn't stay silent any longer. With determination burning in his eyes, he headed to Aisha's house, hoping for just a moment to see his son, to let him know he was there. The thought of being shut out again made his stomach twist with desperation. As he reached the doorstep, his pulse quickened. He rang the bell, his hand trembling slightly. 5 long years had passed, and now, here he was, on the threshold of the family he had lost. The door creaked open. Standing there was Aisha's father, his expression unreadable, his posture stiff with disapproval. "What do you want, Tunde?" Mr. Ibrahim's voice was cold, dismissive. Tunde swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. "I came to see my son." Mr. Ibrahim folded his arms across his chest. "You think you can just waltz back into our lives after all these years? That you can show up and pretend nothing happened?" Tunde's voice was steady, though anger simmered beneath the surface. I'm not here to take him away. I just want to see him, to be part of his life. I know I made mistakes, but I'm ready to make it right. Mr. Ibrahim shook his head, his expression darkening. You had your chance, Tunde. You weren't there for Aisha, you weren't there for Khalid, and now you think you can just barge in as if everything's changed? No, I won't allow it. You're not welcome here. The weight of those words hit Tunde like a punch to the gut, but he wasn't going to back down. He took a step forward, his jaw tightening. I'm not asking for your permission, he said, his voice low but unwavering. I'm going to fight for my son. If I have to take this to court, then so be it. I'll see you there, Mr. Ibrahim. Mr. Ibrahim didn't flinch. Do what you want, Tunde, but know this, there's no place for you here. With that, he slammed the door in Tunde's face, leaving him standing alone in the quiet street, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and determination. He had been denied access to his own son again. But this time he wouldn't take no for an answer. Later that evening, Tunde met with his lawyer, Barrister Chinedu, who had been guiding him through the legal complexities of his custody battle. After recounting what had happened, Tunde's frustration was evident. They won't let me see him, Chinedu, he said, his voice tight with anger. I tried calling. I went to the house, but Aisha's father shut me out completely. I'm done waiting. I need to take this to court. Chinedu leaned back in his chair, weighing Tunde's words. You have every right to fight for your son, Tunde. The law is on your side. Aisha's father can't keep you away from Khalid without just cause. We'll file for visitation rights and full custody if necessary, but be prepared. This won't be easy. Tunde nodded, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let Aisha's father dictate his relationship with his son. He had a right to be a father, and he would do whatever it took to prove it. The next morning, Tunde and Barrister Chinedu officially filed a petition in court, requesting visitation rights and, eventually, joint custody of Khalid. As Tunde signed the papers, his heart pounded. He knew this was just the beginning of a long, difficult battle. But he was ready to fight. He had to. His son deserved to know him, and Tunde was willing to go to any lengths to make that happen. As the legal process unfolded, Tunde pushed forward, refusing to let Khalid grow up without knowing his father. He wasn't just fighting for visitation rights, he was fighting for his family, for a second chance at the life he had always dreamed of with Aisha and Khalid. And as the court date loomed closer, his resolve never wavered. This was just the first step, but it was a step toward redemption. No matter how hard the road ahead, he was ready to walk it, one step at a time, until he had his son in his arms again. On the day of the hearing, Tunde sat in the courtroom beside his lawyer, his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Then the judge entered, Justice Musa Ibrahim. Tunde's stomach tightened. He had no idea who the man was. As the proceedings began, Chinedu suddenly leaned in, his expression tense. Tunde, we have a serious problem. Tunde frowned. What is it? His lawyer's voice was low but firm. The judge, Justice Musa Ibrahim, he's Aisha's uncle. Tunde's heart pounded. His gaze flickered to the judge, and in that moment he grasped the weight of the battle ahead. Justice Musa adjusted his glasses. Let's proceed. Tunde clenched his fists. This wasn't just a court case anymore. It was a fight for his son, for his love, for everything they had built, and he wasn't going to lose. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Seated at the claimant's table, Tunde adjusted his tie, his jaw tightening. He had never imagined he would have to take Aisha and her father to court over custody and visitation rights for his own child. All he wanted was fairness, justice, and the right to be in his son's life without interference. Yet as he sat beside his lawyer, Barrister Chinedu, a wave of unease washed over him. Chinedu, a man of sharp intellect and calm demeanor, leaned in and whispered, "We have a serious issue." Tunde frowned. "What issue?" Chinedu adjusted his glasses and subtly motioned toward the judge's bench. The judge assigned to our case is Justice Musa Ibrahim. At first, Tunde didn't grasp the significance. And, Lanra, his close friend and legal advisor, interjected, "Justice Musa is Aisha's uncle." Tunde's stomach dropped. His gaze snapped to the judge, a middle-aged man flipping through the case file. "You're joking." Chinedu shook his head. "I wish I were." Tunde's fists clenched under the table. This was a clear conflict of interest. There was no way Aisha's uncle could preside over a case involving his own family without bias. The thought of fighting a rigged battle filled him with frustration. He needed to act fast. Barrister Chinedu, ever meticulous, reminded him of his right to a fair trial under the Nigerian legal system. The 1999 Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, particularly Section 36, guaranteed every citizen the right to a fair hearing and an impartial judge. No court could allow a judge with a personal or familial interest in a case to preside over it. Justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. Tunde turned to Chinedu sharply. "Can we apply for another judge?" "Yes, we can," Chinedu assured him. Under the rules of natural justice, a judge must recuse himself from any case where there is a real or perceived bias. We'll file a motion requesting that Justice Musa step down and have the case reassigned. Tunde exhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay composed. His emotions threatened to take over, but this wasn't the time for an outburst. He needed to be strategic. Moments later, Aisha and her father entered the courtroom, followed closely by her lawyer, Barrister Collins. Collins was an aggressive litigator, notorious for his sharp tongue and theatrical courtroom tactics. Tunde knew he wouldn't let the challenge to the judge go unopposed. As the session began, Justice Musa adjusted his glasses and glanced at both parties. "Let's proceed." Before anything else could happen, Barrister Chinedu stood up, his voice steady but firm. "My lord, with due respect, we have a preliminary objection." Justice Musa frowned slightly. "Proceed, counsel." Chinedu cleared his throat. "My lord, we wish to bring an important issue to your attention. We have reason to believe there is a conflict of interest, as your lordship is directly related to one of the parties." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Barrister Collins immediately rose in protest. "My lord, this is nothing more than a delay tactic. Counsel is simply trying to disrupt proceedings." Chinedu remained composed. "Not at all, my lord. The Nigerian Code of Conduct for Judicial Officers clearly states that a judge must disqualify himself from any case where his impartiality may be reasonably questioned. Furthermore, under the Fundamental Rights Enforcement Procedure rules, every litigant is entitled to a fair hearing before an independent and impartial tribunal." Justice Musa's expression hardened as he turned to Tunde. "Do you also believe I cannot be fair in this matter?" Tunde stood, his voice firm yet respectful. "My lord, I do not doubt your qualifications or integrity. However, justice must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. This case involves close family members, and I believe another judge should preside over it." The judge remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the request settling over the courtroom. Then, with a slow nod, he turned back to Chinedu. "File a formal application, and I will recuse myself. The case will be reassigned." Barrister Collins, clearly frustrated, protested again. "My lord, this is an inconvenience." Justice Musa raised a hand, cutting him off. "Counsel, the integrity of the judiciary must remain unquestionable. The case will be reassigned." Relief flooded through Tunde. He had walked into the courtroom fearing an unfair trial, but now at least he had ensured that the judgment, whatever it would be, would come from a neutral and impartial court. Barrister Chinedu wasted no time filing the application, citing the doctrine of natural justice and referencing Nigerian case law, including the landmark case of Dedu Aviz Okorodudu, which emphasized that a judge must step aside whenever his impartiality is in question. As the court adjourned, Lanre clapped a hand on Tunde's back. "Good move, bro. Now we can actually have a fair fight." Tunde nodded, taking a deep breath. This battle was far from over, but at least he had ensured that the Nigerian legal system would work fairly for him. With Lanre by his side and Barrister Chinedu leading his case, he knew one thing for sure: justice would prevail. The courtroom was tense as everyone settled into their seats. The case, initially assigned to Justice Musa Ibrahim, had now been transferred to Justice Adebayo Williams due to concerns of bias. Tunde Adewale sat beside his lawyer, Barrister Chinedu, his heart pounding. Across from him, Alhaji Ibrahim and his daughter Aisha sat with their lawyer, Barrister Collins. This was no longer just a custody battle. Tunde had formally charged Alhaji Ibrahim with unlawfully preventing him from seeing his son. The accusations were serious, and today the court would determine whether Tunde had been wrongfully kept away, or if he had simply failed as a father. Justice Adebayo Williams cleared his throat as he glanced over the documents before him. His sharp eyes moved between both parties before he spoke. This court acknowledges that the case has been transferred from Justice Musa Ibrahim due to concerns regarding impartiality. Furthermore, we recognize that the plaintiff, Mr. Tunde Adewale, is not only seeking custody rights, but has also accused the defendant, Mr. Alhaji Ibrahim, of unlawfully preventing him from seeing his child. Barrister Chinedu, you may proceed. Barrister Chinedu rose confidently. My lord, the claim that my client, Mr. Tunde Adewale, abandoned his child is entirely false. While it is true that he was absent during the early years, this was not by choice. At the time of the pregnancy, he had just completed his National Youth Service (NYSC) and was financially unstable. The shock of unexpected fatherhood overwhelmed him, as it would many young men in similar situations. He hesitated, but before he could fully process his responsibilities, Aisha and the child were taken away from him. He did not refuse responsibility. Rather, he was denied the opportunity to step up. Mr. Ibrahim made a unilateral decision to cut him out of his son's life, in direct violation of Section 4(2) of the Child's Rights Act, which guarantees both parents access to their child. Barrister Collins stood smoothly. My lord, we do not dispute that Mr. Adewale was young and financially unstable at the time. However, that does not excuse his absence. Aisha carried the pregnancy alone, gave birth alone, and raised their child without receiving a single naira from Mr. Adewale. It was only after the child was older, after the hard work had been done, that he suddenly sought to claim fatherhood. My client, Alhaji Ibrahim, simply did what any responsible father would do. He protected his grandson from an absentee parent. If Mr. Adewale had truly wanted to be involved, nothing would have stopped him. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. Justice Williams turned to Tunde. Mr. Adewale, while the law acknowledges that no one is perfect, you admit to hesitating when you first learned about the pregnancy. The defense argues that you made no effort to support your child. What do you have to say? Tunde took a deep breath and stood. His voice, though shaky, carried the weight of his emotions. My lord, I do not deny that I was afraid. I had just completed my NYSC and had no stable income. I didn't even know how to take care of myself, let alone a child. I was terrified of failing my son. But I did not abandon him. I reached out. I inquired about Aisha. I tried to communicate. But by the time I was ready to take responsibility, they were gone. I was denied access. I am not here to rewrite the past, my lord. I am here because I love my son. I am here because, no matter how late, I want to be a father to him. I plead with this court, on compassionate grounds, to grant me the chance to be in my son's life. A hush fell over the courtroom as Justice Williams considered Tunde's words. After a moment, he sighed and spoke. This is a complex case. While it is true that Mr. Adewale initially hesitated, it is also evident that he was not given a fair opportunity to be involved. Mr. Ibrahim had no legal authority to deny him access to his child. The law does not punish a man for being young and afraid, but it does hold accountable those who obstruct parental rights. Mr. Ibrahim, this court finds you guilty of unlawfully preventing Mr. Adewale from seeing his child. You are hereby fined and ordered to issue a formal apology. Alhaji Ibrahim tensed but did not argue. Justice Williams then turned to Tunde. However, the court also acknowledges that you must earn your place in your child's life. You cannot simply reappear after years of absence and expect immediate rights. Therefore, this court grants you supervised visitations. If you remain consistent and prove your commitment, you may apply for joint custody in the future. Any further obstruction from the defendant's family will result in legal consequences. With that, the judge brought the gavel down. Tunde exhaled sharply, a mix of relief and emotion washing over him. He hadn't won everything, but he had won the chance to be a father. Across the room, Aisha wiped at her eyes. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of healing for all of them. The courtroom remained heavy with tension as the ruling was made, supervised visitation rights. To some, it might have seemed like a small victory, but to Tunde, it was everything. After years of waiting, fighting, and proving himself, He finally had the chance to be a part of his son's life. But this wasn't just about visitation. It was about redemption. About proving he could be the father Khalid deserved, and the man Aisha had once hoped he would become. Days passed, and the visits continued. Tunde was there every time, arriving early, staying late, making every moment with Khalid count. He learned how to care for his son, how to connect with him, and how to be the father he had never been before. At first, Khalid was hesitant, unsure of this man who had suddenly appeared in his life. But slowly, the walls began to come down. Tunde showed him patience, kindness, and unwavering love. From a distance, Aisha watched, torn between the emotions she had buried for so long. She had wanted to protect Khalid from the pain of an absent father. But seeing how Tunde had changed, how deeply he cared for their son, she began to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, he was truly ready. One afternoon, after a particularly tender moment between father and son, Aisha stood in the doorway watching them. Tunde was on the floor with Khalid, teaching him how to tie his shoes, patiently explaining each step as the young boy tried his best. Khalid smiled triumphantly as he finally got the knot right. Tunde laughed, lifting him up and praising him, his joy evident. Aisha's heart tightened. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. Aisha's heart softened. She had watched Tunde grow over the years, but this was different. He wasn't just a man trying to earn a second chance. He was a father. Khalid's father. And he was giving him everything he needed. She stepped into the room, her footsteps barely making a sound. Tunde looked up, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. Khalid, still grinning, ran up to his mother, proudly showing off his new skill. Aisha couldn't help but smile as she watched the bond forming between them. She took a deep breath before speaking. Tunde? He stood up slowly, sensing the shift in her tone. Aisha? She hesitated, then spoke again. I've been watching you, and I've seen how much you've changed, how much you're willing to fight for Khalid and for us. I can't ignore that anymore. Her voice trembled slightly. I want to give you a chance. I want to believe in you again. Tunde's heart swelled with hope, but he didn't rush to speak. He knew words alone wouldn't be enough to make up for the past. But actions like this, could. He stepped closer, his voice low and sincere. Thank you, Aisha. I won't let you down. I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I'm the father Khalid deserves and the man you can count on. Without another word, Aisha stepped into his arms. She held him tightly, letting herself feel the warmth of his embrace. It had taken time, but now she finally believed they could move forward together. Khalid watched them, a small smile tugging at his lips before running off to play. Meanwhile, from the doorway, Aisha's mother quietly observed. She had been skeptical at first, but seeing the way Tunde treated their grandson, patient, loving, and so clearly invested in his happiness, made her realize just how much he had changed. Later that evening, as they sat together in the living room, Aisha's mother turned to her husband. I've seen it, Ibrahim. I've seen how much Tunde loves our daughter and our grandson, how much he's willing to fight for them. We've watched him grow, and now, I think he deserves a chance. Her husband, who had been silent until now, looked at her thoughtfully. He had never been one to forgive easily, but he couldn't ignore the truth before him. Tunde had fought for his son, for his family, and in the end his actions spoke louder than any words. I've seen it too, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I've watched him over the years, and I've seen how much he loves Aisha. He's done what I never thought possible. He's earned my respect, and he's earned his place in our family. Aisha's father stood up and walked toward the door, his steps slow and deliberate. He paused before turning back to face his wife. I'm going to speak to Tunde. I think it's time we welcome him back, welcome him into the family with open arms. That evening, Tunde sat nervously in Aisha's living room, unsure of what to expect. When the door opened, he looked up to see Aisha's father standing in the doorway. His heart pounded as he quickly stood. Ibrahim, But Aisha's father raised a hand to stop him. Tunde, you've fought for this family, and you've shown more than I ever expected. I see now how much you love Aisha and Khalid. I see how much you're willing to fight for them. You've earned my respect, and more importantly, you've earned your place in this family. Tunde's breath caught in his throat, overwhelmed by the weight of those words. "I welcome you, Tunde, as a son-in-law," Aisha's father said, his voice filled with warmth and sincerity. "And I give you my blessing to be with my daughter. May you continue to be the father Khalid needs and the man Aisha deserves." With those words, Tunde's heart swelled with relief and joy. He stepped forward, shaking Aisha's father's hand, knowing that this moment marked the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. As Aisha entered the room, Tunde pulled her close, his heart full of gratitude. They had been through so much, but now they had finally found their way back to each other. With Khalid in their lives and the blessing of both their families, they could face anything together. And for the first time in years, Tunde truly felt that he had a family that loved him, accepted him, and one he would never stop fighting for. If you enjoyed this story, kindly subscribe to this channel to receive more of our latest Nollywood stories.